The lantern flickered against the cabin window, the first light Ethan Cole had seen there in 10 years. He dismounted slowly, every muscle in his weathered body tense. His Colt .45 hung heavy at his hip, a cold and constant companion. Out here in the Wyoming Territory, 40 miles from the nearest hint of civilization in Cheyenne, strangers meant trouble. They meant rustlers, claim jumpers, or worse, far worse. But as he pushed open the warped wooden door, what he saw inside made his blood freeze solid in his veins. A woman sat in Clara's chair, reading Clara's diary by candlelight. Golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like wheat in a summer wind he hadn't felt in a decade. The same delicate hands that had once touched his face, the same graceful curve of a neck that had haunted his every waking moment and his few fitful dreams for 10 long years. Clara. The word escaped his lips like a prayer, or maybe a curse. She looked up, and those familiar, deep brown eyes met his. But the face was different, younger, wilder, and impossibly, terrifyingly alive. "I'm Eliza," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the silent cabin. "Clara's sister." Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the grip of his gun. In that single, heart-stopping moment, every carefully built wall around his frozen heart began to crumble into dust. 10 years of perfect solitude, 10 years of faithful, unwavering mourning. All of it shattered by a face that was both a memory and a betrayal. A ghost made of flesh and blood, sitting in his dead wife's chair, holding her most private thoughts in her hands. What was a man supposed to do when the past came back to life, wearing a different face, when desire and guilt collided like a thunderclap right inside his chest? The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that usually soothed him. Tonight, it sounded like it was screaming. He finally holstered his gun, the click echoing in the tense silence. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Clara's letters," Eliza said. She stood and he saw how the frontier had already started to change her. The soft lines of Denver society were sharpening into something harder, more real, more dangerous. "She wrote about you, about this place, about being happy." "Happy?" The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "She died here," he said, the words flat and hard as stone. "In that bed, calling for a help I couldn't give her. She lived here first." Eliza's voice had an edge Clara's never did, a spark of defiance. 2 years of living. That's more than most people ever get." He remembered those 2 years like a fever dream. Clara Bennett, 20 years old, stepping off the Union Pacific train in Cheyenne. Pure Denver aristocracy. Silk dresses and pearl earrings, and a way of looking at the world like it owed her something beautiful. But when she looked at Ethan Cole, the rough-edged rancher with calloused hands, she saw something else entirely. "You don't talk much," she'd said at a town dance, her gloved hand resting like a feather on his arm. "Don't have much worth saying to folks like you," he'd replied, honest to a fault. Her laugh had been like silver bells. "Maybe that's exactly why I want to hear it." 2 months later, she scandalized her entire family by marrying him. She traded silk for calico, ballrooms for a one-room cabin under an endless Wyoming sky. And for 2 perfect, impossible years, she'd been happy. He saw it in the letters she wrote to her little sister Eliza. Letters filled with a joy so pure it almost hurt to remember. "I never knew happiness could be so quiet," she told him one night, her head on his shoulder as the sunset painted the grasslands pure gold. Then came the winter that broke everything, the blizzard of '77. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. For 6 weeks, the world disappeared under a blanket of white death. Clara caught pneumonia. By the 6th week, Ethan was digging her grave with his bare hands in the frozen earth behind their cabin. She died whispering his name, her fever-bright eyes looking right through him. And now her sister sat in their home. The resemblance was a constant twisting ache in his chest. But where Clara had been gentle water, this girl was wildfire. The wind rattled the windows. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. With the nearest town 40 miles away through treacherous country, this girl, this dangerous echo of his past, would be staying the night. Maybe longer. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he watched her move around Clara's kitchen with an unconscious grace that was all her own, something deep in his chest began to thaw. something that felt dangerously close to hope. But hope, Ethan Cole was about to learn, could be the most dangerous thing of all. 3 weeks passed like scenes from a dream he couldn't wake from. Eliza couldn't cook to save her life. She burned the bacon, oversalted the beans, and turned coffee into something that could strip paint off a barn door. But she tried. Every single morning she tried. She couldn't ride worth a damn either. The first time she helped him check the cattle, she fell off her horse 3 times and nearly got trampled. But she got back up every single time. Clara had been graceful from the start, as if she were born to the frontier. Eliza fought for every skill, earned every callus, won every small victory through sheer, stubborn will. And God help him, Ethan found himself watching her. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. The way she'd push escape strands of hair from her face with the back of a dirty hand. The way she threw her head back and laughed. A sound so different from Clara's, yet just as captivating. She was nothing like Clara. She was everything like Clara. And she kept reading the diary. Every night by the fire, she'd have that leather-bound book open. Sometimes she'd look up at him with a strange expression, a question in her eyes she never asked out loud. "Did Clara ever mention a man named Blackwood?" she asked one night, out of the blue. "Silas Blackwood? Owns the spread to the north." Ethan grunted, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Greedy son of a bitch. Tried to buy this land from me right after. After. He wanted it before too, didn't he?" Eliza pressed. "Clara mentions him. A lot. Said he kept visiting." "He's a neighbor," Ethan said, a cold knot tightening in his gut. "People are neighborly out here." But he knew, even as he said it, that Blackwood's visits had never felt neighborly. They'd felt like a vulture circling. Then came the night that changed everything. A December wind howled like a living thing around the cabin. Ethan had gone to Cheyenne for supplies, leaving Eliza alone for the first time, a mistake he'd regret for the rest of his life. He was a mile out when he smelled it. Not wood smoke, something else. The acrid smell of trouble, horse lather, and unwashed bodies. He rode in quiet, dismounting 100 yards from the cabin, moving like a shadow. A skill learned from protecting his herd from wolves, both the four-legged kind and the worst ones that walked on two. Through the window he saw it. 2 men had cornered her, drifters by the look of them. One was inside, advancing on her, a sick grin on his face. The other blocked the door. Eliza was backed against the wall, Clara's old Winchester rifle shaking in her hands. "Easy there, sweetheart," the first one was saying, his voice thick with whiskey. "We're just looking for a warm place to spend the night. And some company." "Get out," Eliza's voice was steady, but Ethan could see the terror. "I'll shoot," she warned. The man laughed. "You even know how to work that thing?" As he lunged for the rifle, he said something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. "Blackwood said you'd be stubborn, just like the last one." The last one. Ethan didn't think. He moved. The man at the door never saw him. Ethan's knife found the gap between his ribs, silent and final. The second man turned, his eyes wide with shock. Just in time to meet the barrel of Ethan's Colt. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice a low growl that promised death. "Now." The surviving drifter took one look at his partner's still form and bolted into the night like a spooked coyote. When the dust settled, the rifle clattered to the floor, and Eliza collapsed into Ethan's arms. She was shaking like a leaf in a storm, and for the first time, she felt small and fragile. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide and dark in the lamplight, and something shifted between them. Some invisible line was crossed. "He mentioned Blackwood," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said, just like the last one." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Suddenly, it wasn't just a random attack. It was a message. And the past wasn't just a ghost. It was an unsolved crime. He looked from her terrified face to the dead man on the floor, and a new, terrible suspicion began to take root in his soul. Clara hadn't just died from the winter. Had she? He gently pushed Eliza behind him, his gun still raised. The night was quiet again, but the silence was a lie. The real threat wasn't some random drifter. It was a neighbor, a man who wanted this land, A man who might have killed for it once before. And in that moment, Ethan knew this wasn't just about protecting a ghost's memory anymore. It was about uncovering a murder. The dead man lay on the cabin floor, a stark and brutal testament to the violence that had just exploded in their lives. Ethan dragged the body outside into the freezing night, the crunch of his boots on the snow the only sound. When he came back in, Eliza was stoking the fire, her hands still shaking. She was wearing one of Clara's old dresses, a simple blue calico with tiny buttons up the front. The struggle had torn the fabric at her shoulder, revealing the smooth, pale skin beneath. In the flickering firelight, she looked like something from a man's deepest, most forbidden dreams. She looked up, her eyes locking with his. The shared danger, the adrenaline, the terror. It had stripped away all the pretense between them. All that was left was something raw and undeniable. "Ethan," she whispered, and the way she said his name made his entire body go tight with a want so fierce it scared him. He moved toward her, drawn by a force he could no longer fight. His hands found her face, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. Her lips parted slightly, and he could see the rapid flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. His eyes followed the line of exposed skin where her dress was torn. He saw her notice where he was looking. Instead of pulling away, she reached up with a trembling hand and slowly, deliberately unfastened another button. Then another. The fabric whispered as it slipped lower. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful in a way that made his hands shake, all soft curves and pale skin that seemed to glow in the firelight. When she reached for the buttons of his own shirt, her fingers brushing against his chest, he didn't stop her. Cotton fell away, revealing the hard plains of his chest, mapped with the scars of a decade of hard living and harder grief. She traced one with her fingertip, and the gentle touch sent fire racing through his veins. "Eliza," his voice was rough, a warning to her, to himself. But she was beyond hearing warnings. Her hands moved to his belt buckle. When their bodies finally came together, skin against skin, the world outside the cabin, the cold, the dead man, the looming threat of Silas Blackwood, it all ceased to exist. They moved toward the bed like sleepwalkers, caught in a tide bigger than choice, bigger than morality, bigger than the ghost that stood between them. Her dress pooled on the floor beside his pants. When she lay back against the pillows, her golden hair spread like a halo across the white linen, Ethan thought he might die from the sheer force of wanting her. She reached for him, her eyes full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. He was lost, until his eyes fell on the nightstand, on the small silver-framed photograph beside the bed. Clara's wedding portrait. Her gentle smile, frozen in time, seemed to look right through him, seeing everything, judging everything. What was he doing? This was Clara's bed, Clara's room, Clara's sister. The cold reality crashed back in like an avalanche of ice water. "I can't," he choked out, pulling away so fast Eliza gasped. "God, forgive me, I can't do this." He grabbed his shirt and fled, stumbling out of the cabin and into the relative sanity of the barn, leaving Eliza alone in the rumpled bed. Confusion and a deep, shimmering hurt were written across her beautiful face. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, but inside Ethan's chest, a different, more violent storm was just beginning. He leaned against the rough wood of the barn wall, gasping for air as if he'd been holding his breath for 10 years. The image of Clara's smiling face was burned into his mind, but it was tangled with the look of betrayal in Eliza's eyes. He had run from her, from the warmth and the life she offered, straight back into the arms of his cold, familiar grief. But this time, the grief felt different. It was tainted. The drifter's words echoed in his head. "Blackwood said you'd be stubborn, just like the last one. Just like the last one. Just like Clara." He strode back to the cabin, his mind racing. He burst through the door. Eliza was sitting up in bed, clutching the sheets to her chest, her face pale. He ignored her, striding over to the small wooden chest where Clara kept her things. He threw it open. There at the bottom was her diary. He snatched it up and brought it to the firelight, his hands shaking. Eliza watched him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. understanding. I tried to tell you, she whispered. There are things in there, things that don't make sense. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning Clara's elegant script. He knew these entries. He'd read them 100 times, torturing himself with her descriptions of their happiness. But now he was reading with new eyes. He was looking for a name. Blackwood. He found it. In the last few months of her life, the entries changed. October 12th, 1876. Mr. Blackwood called again today. He is very persistent about the land. He says this valley is no place for a woman raised in the city, that the winters are too hard. There was a look in his eye I did not like. November 3rd, 1876. Another visit from Mr. Blackwood. Ethan was out on the range. He brought a jar of his wife's preserves. A gift, he said, for the coming winter. I have been feeling so tired lately. The cold must be settling into my bones already. November 20th, 1876. I feel weaker every day. The doctor in Cheyenne says it is exhaustion, that I am not built for this life. But it feels like more than that. It feels like I am fading. Mr. Blackwood offered Ethan a price for the ranch today that is far more than it is worth. Why is he so desperate? Ethan's blood ran cold. Preserves. A gift. A slow, creeping weakness that everyone had blamed on the weather and her delicate constitution. There's more, Eliza said, her voice barely audible. She slipped out of the bed, wrapping a blanket around herself, and came to his side. She pointed to the inside of the diary's back cover. A single page had been carefully folded and tucked into a small pocket in the leather. Clara's writing was shaky, almost illegible. December 5th, 1876. I am sure of it now. It is the preserves. I only feel this way after I have eaten them. A sickness in my stomach, a fog in my mind. He is poisoning me. I tried to tell Ethan, but he thinks I am delirious with fever. Blackwood wants this land. He wants the water rights from the creek. He knows Ethan will never sell as long as I am here. Happy. He means to have me gone. God help me, I am so afraid. Ethan stared at the page, the words blurring through a sudden haze of rage and grief. 10 years. For 10 years, he had blamed himself. He had blamed the Wyoming winter, the pneumonia, his own inability to save her. He had carried the guilt like a shroud. But it wasn't the winter that killed her. It was murder. He looked at Eliza, and the desire he felt for her was now forged with something new, something powerful, a shared purpose. She was not a replacement for his past. She was the key to its truth. He's not getting away with it, Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. He killed my wife. He tried to kill you. This ends now. The betrayal was a physical thing, a shard of ice in his gut. Silas Blackwood had shaken his hand, shared a drink with him at the saloon in Cheyenne, even offered his condolences after Clara's death, all while knowing he was the one who had put her in that frozen ground. The man hadn't just murdered his wife, he had mocked his grief for a decade. Ethan looked over at Eliza. The hurt from his rejection was still in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a fierce resolve. She had come here following the ghost of her sister, and instead, she had walked into the jaws of the wolf that had devoured her. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady now. "We need proof," Ethan said, his mind clicking into a gear it hadn't used in years. The lethargy of grief was gone, replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of vengeance. A confession, or something that ties him to the poison. He thought of the drifter he'd killed. He'd have to bury him deep, far from the cabin. The other one was a loose end, a witness who could either help them or warn Blackwood that the hornet's nest had been kicked. "The sheriff," Eliza said. "We have to go to the sheriff in Cheyenne." "Sheriff Miller's a good man," Ethan conceded, "but he's 50 miles away, and Blackwood owns half the county. His word against mine? Without solid proof, Miller's hands will be tied. Blackwood will say I'm a grieving husband who's lost his mind." He paced the small cabin, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "No, we have to get the proof first. Something undeniable." His eyes landed on the empty mason jar on a high shelf, one Clara had used for flour. It was identical to the ones Blackwood's wife used for her preserves. She wrote that she stopped eating them, Ethan mused, looking at Eliza. What if she didn't throw the last jar away? What if she hid it? It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all they had. For the next hour, they tore the small cabin apart. They looked in the root cellar, under the floorboards, in the dusty crawl space above. Nothing. The hope began to curdle into despair. Maybe she got rid of it, Eliza said softly, sinking onto Clara's chair, looking defeated. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, frustration gnawing at him. He tried to think like Clara. Where would she hide something she was afraid of, but also needed as proof? Something she didn't want him to find, thinking he'd dismiss her fears. Her eyes in his memory drifted to the one place in the cabin that was hers and hers alone. The old hope chest at the foot of the bed. It held her wedding dress, her letters from home, the few precious things she'd brought with her from Denver. He'd never opened it, not once in 10 years. It was too painful. With a deep breath, he knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old memories washed over him. He carefully lifted out the neatly folded silk of her dress. Beneath it were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and under those, wrapped in her wedding veil, was a single sealed jar of blackberry preserves. A label, written in a delicate hand that was not his wife's, read, "From the kitchen of Martha Blackwood. November 1876. They had him. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, lashing the cabin with wind and sleet. They were trapped, at least until morning, but the feeling wasn't one of confinement. It was one of quiet anticipation, like hunters waiting for the dawn. The jar sat on the table between them, a dark and silent confession. The near intimacy, the raw desire that had exploded between them earlier, was still there. It hummed in the air, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of their new, grim purpose. But now it was different. It wasn't about forgetting Clara anymore. It was about honoring her. She was so strong, Eliza said, her fingers tracing the rim of the deadly jar. To know what was happening, to be so afraid, and to still try to fight, to leave this for you. I thought it was me who failed her, Ethan said, his voice thick with a decade of misplaced guilt. I didn't listen. She told me she was scared, and I told her it was the fever talking. The regret was a poison of its own, and it had been killing him slowly for years. You couldn't have known, Eliza said, her hand covering his on the table. Her touch was warm, steady. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of solidarity, of understanding. It anchored him. He knew then that what he felt for her wasn't a betrayal of Clara's memory. It was an extension of it. Clara had brought him a life he never thought he deserved, and now her sister had brought him the truth, a truth that could finally set him free. But first they had to survive until morning. Blackwood's other man was still out there, and Blackwood himself would soon realize his messengers hadn't returned. He would know something was wrong. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Dawn broke gray and cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world encased in a thin, brittle layer of ice. Every tree branch, every blade of grass, glittered in the weak morning light. It was beautiful, and it was treacherous. The road to Cheyenne will be a mess, Ethan said, checking his rifle, then his Colt. But that might work for us. It'll slow him down if he comes looking. You think he'll come here? Eliza asked, her voice tight with anxiety as she packed a small satchel with the jar of preserves, the diary, and some hardtack. I think when his man doesn't come back, he'll get nervous. He'll either send more men or come himself. Either way, we can't be here when he arrives. He had a plan, a risky one. We're not going to Cheyenne, not yet. Eliza looked at him confused. But the sheriff is exactly where Blackwood will expect us to go, Ethan interrupted. He'll have the main road watched. No, we're going to do the one thing he won't expect. We're going to his ranch. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Are you insane? That's suicide. His wife is there, Ethan said, his voice low and intense. Martha Blackwood. She wrote the label on that jar. She may not have known what her husband was doing, what he was putting in it, but maybe she saw something. Maybe she knows something. We need a witness, Eliza. Someone who can place that poison in his hands. That jar is our proof. but her testimony could be our justice. It was a wild gamble. Martha Blackwood was a timid woman, rarely seen in town, who lived entirely in her husband's shadow. If she was loyal to him, she could have them shot for trespassing. But if she lived in fear of him, if she had any conscience at all, she might be the key to everything. Eliza stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. The firebrand he'd first seen in her was back. All right, what's the plan? They rode out an hour later, not on the main trail, but through the rugged, broken country to the north, a path only a man who knew the land intimately could navigate. Ethan pushed their horses hard, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifleman. As they crested a low ridge, Ethan pulled his horse to a sudden halt. He pointed down into the valley toward his own small cabin. Two riders were circling it, moving with a cautious, predatory intent. Blackwood's men. They were too late to be caught at home, but too early to be safe. "They'll find the body," Eliza whispered, her face pale. "I know," Ethan said grimly. "And they'll find us gone. They'll know we're coming for him. We've lost the element of surprise." He urged his horse forward, faster now. The gamble had just gotten 10 times more dangerous. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. The Blackwood Ranch was a fortress, a sprawling main house built of thick pine logs, surrounded by barns, bunkhouses, and corrals that held a herd 10 times the size of Ethan's. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. Men moved about the yard, their rifles carried casually, but ready. This wasn't just a ranch, it was an empire built on greed, and now Ethan knew it was built on murder. "How do we get to her?" Eliza asked, her voice a hushed whisper as they watched from the cover of a rocky outcrop half a mile away. "We don't," Ethan said. "I do." He turned to her, his face set like granite. "You are going to take this evidence," he said, handing her the satchel containing the diary and the jar. "You are going to circle wide around this valley and get to Cheyenne. Ride hard and don't stop for anyone. Give this to Sheriff Miller. Tell him everything." "No," she said instantly, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." "Listen to me," he said, his voice hard, grabbing her arm. "This is not a discussion. My fight with Blackwood is personal. If I go in there, I can create a distraction, buy you time. If we both go, and we get caught, the truth dies with us. Clara's truth dies with us. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and fear. "What kind of distraction?" "The kind he can't ignore," Ethan said, his eyes cold and dark. "I'm going to burn his empire to the ground." Before she could argue, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation and farewell. It was rough and quick and tasted of cold air and unspoken promises. "Now go," he commanded. "Ride." She looked at him one last time, her heart breaking. Then she turned her horse and disappeared into the trees, the precious evidence held tight in her hands. Ethan watched her go until she was gone from sight. Then he turned his attention back to the ranch. He checked his Colt, ensuring every chamber was full. He had 6 shots and a box of matches. It would have to be enough. He waited for dusk, the longest few hours of his life. As the sun bled out behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, he began his approach. He moved on foot, a ghost in the twilight, silent as the falling snow. He skirted the bunkhouse, the smell of frying bacon and bitter coffee hanging in the air. He could hear the men inside laughing and talking, oblivious. His target was the massive main barn. It was filled with hay for the winter, the lifeblood of the ranch. It was also highly flammable. He reached the side of the barn undetected. He pulled out the matches, his fingers numb with cold. He struck one, the tiny flame flaring to life, a small beacon of defiance in the vast darkness. He held it to a loose bale of hay he'd pulled from the wall. It caught slowly at first, then with a hungry whoosh, the fire roared to life, climbing the dry timbers of the barn wall. He didn't wait to admire his work. He ran, using the chaos as his cover. Shouts erupted from the bunkhouse as men poured out, their faces illuminated by the growing orange glow. The fire was spreading faster than he'd imagined, leaping from the barn to a nearby shed. In the confusion, he slipped toward the main house. His goal was not just to burn, but to confront. He needed to look the devil in the eye. He kicked open the back door of the kitchen and stepped inside. Martha Blackwood was there, a frail, bird-like woman with terror in her eyes. She screamed, and from the adjoining room, Silas Blackwood appeared, a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He was a big man, with a florid face and small, cunning eyes that widened in shock when he saw Ethan. "Cole," he breathed, leveling the shotgun. "You're a dead man." "Not before you," Ethan said, his Colt steady in his hand, aimed directly at Blackwood's heart. "This is for Clara." Behind Blackwood, in the doorway, Ethan saw a flicker of movement, one of the ranch hands drawn by the commotion. He was outgunned, trapped. He had bought Eliza her time, but it had cost him his own life. But just as Blackwood's knuckles whitened on the trigger, Martha did something unexpected. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might, crashing it against the side of her husband's head. Blackwood staggered, his eyes rolling back in his head, a look of pure astonishment on his face. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling as he crumpled to the floor in a heap. The ranch hand in the doorway froze, unsure what to do. "He killed her," Martha sobbed, looking at Ethan, her face a mask of terror and liberation. "He killed that sweet girl. I knew it. I always knew it." The barn was now a raging inferno, lighting up the entire valley. Ethan looked from the unconscious man on the floor to the terrified woman who had just saved his life. He had his confession. But just as a wave of relief washed over him, he heard it. The sound of a dozen horses riding hard, not away from the ranch, but toward it. And they weren't Blackwood's men. Leading the charge, silhouetted against the roaring flames, was Eliza. She hadn't run to Cheyenne. She had run for help, and she'd brought back the law. Sheriff Miller and a posse of deputies were surrounding the house. The game was over. The aftermath was a blur. Sheriff Miller, a grim-faced man with honest eyes, took Blackwood into custody. Martha, weeping but resolute, told him everything she had suspected for years, how her husband's greed had curdled into something monstrous. The diary, the jar, and her testimony, it was an ironclad case. The surviving drifter was rounded up a day later and sang like a canary, confessing that Blackwood had hired them to scare Eliza away. Or worse, justice, swift and sure, had finally come to the valley. As the posse led Blackwood away in chains, Ethan stood with Eliza, watching the last of his barn burn against the starry sky. His home was gone, but for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel homeless. He turned to her, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I thought I told you to ride to Cheyenne." A small smile touched her lips. "I did. I just found the sheriff on the trail. Told him there was a fire he needed to put out." She paused, her smile fading. "I couldn't leave you. I'm not Clara, Ethan. I don't break that easy." He knew she was right. She wasn't Clara. She was Eliza, a woman forged in her own fire, strong and brave and miraculously, impossibly here. The ghost that had haunted him for a decade was finally at peace, not because he had forgotten her, but because he had finally honored her. He had found her truth. He reached out and took her hand. It was warm and real and felt like a beginning. "Come on," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "Let's go home." He no longer had a cabin, but he knew that home wasn't a place built of logs and mud. It was something you built with someone else, something you defended, something you came back to. As they rode away from the smoldering ruins of Blackwood's ranch, their shadows stretched long behind them. Two figures riding not away from the past, but into a future they would have to build together from the ashes. If this tale of love, loss, and long-awaited justice gripped your heart, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories from the Old West can travel. And if you want more tales from the untamed frontier, where secrets lie buried just beneath the dust, and a single spark of courage can set the whole world ablaze, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because out here, every story is a matter of life and death, and the best ones are yet to be told. Until next time, Keep your wits sharp and your aim true.